Good evening everyone and welcome to another Cyclone Chasers update. Today, the 30th of December 2012. We have a lot to get through tonight, but before we do start that, we would like to draw your attention to our donation drive to the Typhoon Bofa victims and survivors in the Philippines. From now until midnight New Year's Eve, if you purchase our online documentary, we will be giving at least 50%, slightly more than that, of your video purchase to the survivors and the victims of the Typhoon Bofa disaster in the Philippines. So it costs $3 to watch for 7 days, and it has a time limit of 7 days on it, or it costs $8 for you to download to own and just have a look at what a cyclone's really about and what it feels and looks like inside one if you've never been in one. It's a fairly good little buy, and you're also donating to a very good cause. Okay, let's get into our update today. And the big news of today is Tropical Cyclone Mitchell has now become ex-Tropical Cyclone Mitchell, still producing some gales, but no longer more than halfway around the system. Remember last night we talked about exactly what a tropical cyclone needs to be and to have to be called a tropical cyclone. Mitchell now no longer meets those requirements because he's only got gales in one quadrant. So we can see here still some gale force winds, still expected to move to the south or south-southwest, and then possibly a recurve back to the southeast towards the Western Australian coast as a low pressure system. Nothing more than a couple of showers and maybe a couple of wind gusts. So that was Mitchell. So, Nitzo, why the hell did Mitch die so quickly? Well, in the past couple of days we've been alluding to dry air entrainment, which is the amount of dry air that's west or just west of the system getting into the system circulation. Now you can see here's Mitchell's circulation, and right in through here, if you just follow my cursor around, you can see this dry air wrapping right into the center of its circulation from the west here, and that's resulted in Mitchell not being able to sustain his convection. And therefore, if you can't sustain those thunderstorms, it can't sustain the constant rebuilding of those storms. It can't sustain those winds coming into the center all the time, and those winds start to die down, and then the system can no longer maintain itself. If you take a look at Mitch from earlier on in the afternoon, about 4:30 p.m. Queensland time, we can see the banding in and around here, but you can see really a lack of any real central convection to the system. You can see a little bit of convection out here to the southeast, and if we go back to what the Bureau was showing us, this is the area where we're still experiencing those gale force winds. So really not much left to Mitchell now in terms of any deep convection, but where there is deep convection to that southeastern quadrant, there are still gale force winds associated with it. If we look at Mitchell's future track, we can see fairly tight model agreement in this track, as opposed to what we'll show you when we talk about Freda. We do expect Mitchell to do exactly this as a low pressure system, as nothing more than that. So once again, that's about all we need to talk about Mitchell for, I'd say. So we'll get into Freda. Issued at 6 p.m. Queensland time, severe tropical cyclone Freda, category 4 tropical cyclone now, pushing to the southeast, expected to shift more towards the south and then south-southwest before pushing back to the southeast, getting to around about here, and then we will show you a whole bunch of things that it can do from here. So this is what we're expecting. As it starts to push a little bit more the second time round, as it pushes to the southeast, it's going to encounter increasing wind shear values. So that's the change of direction and speed with height, and I'll show you what that is, what that looks like in the model shortly. But basically the system will not impact the New Caledonian coastline as a category 4 or above system. It is likely to weaken pretty significantly on approach to landfall, if it makes landfall, that is. And there's other types of model thinking that suggests it's just going to meander here for a while before deciding whether it wants to push towards Queensland or deciding whether it wants to push towards New Zealand. So a lot of that's up in the air, but we'll talk about that a bit more in a bit more detail shortly. We'll just have a look at what it looks like on satellite at the moment. We can clearly see on satellite this afternoon that Tropical Cyclone Freda is definitely moving to the south-southeast. There's no doubt about that. We can see a very nicely defined eye there at some stages this afternoon. It's now a lot less defined this evening, and we'll go through some of the reasoning why it might be losing a little bit of strength in the last couple of frames, but overall it's still a very nicely structured tropical cyclone. We can see the system is currently up here and it's tracking into continued positive areas of oceanic heat content. So even at 5 days time, as this model or as this thinking suggests, it's going to hit New Caledonia. New Caledonia is still in an area of enough oceanic heat content to maintain the system. And then if it does what longer term some projections are suggesting and pushes back to the west, it still has enough oceanic heat content to continue that track. But as it pushes to the southeast, if it decides to take that track, it will eventually die out and become extratropical. Looking at Freda's wind field, we can see large area of gales. The interesting thing with Freda's wind field at the moment now, as opposed to what it was like yesterday, is the greater extent of gales on its northern edge. Now you can see the satellite product here is suggesting 35 to 50 knots, extending well away now to the north. It still doesn't have much of a gale field to its northwestern quadrant, but it's quite good looking in terms of its symmetry compared to what it has been up until later on this afternoon. You can see the very, very intense eye wall here, 80 knots plus, and getting up to 100 knots just in those little two regions there right next to the eye. So very, very small area of extreme winds, and you can see that a little bit more in the zoomed up image, that you've got that very tight area of extreme winds right in there, with a general area of about 20 or 30 kilometers of winds over 80 knots. So definitely more symmetrical system than it has been. Still lacking a little bit to its northwest though, but overall looks a lot better than it has done at any point in its lifetime. The total precipitable water product shows us that there isn't any real dry air or threat of dry air encroaching into the circulation. I mean, there's a little bit of dry air way out here in the periphery near PNG, but that's really no chance of getting into the circulation like it did with Mitchell. There is a little bit of dry air here to the south of New Caledonia, or between New Caledonia and Vanuatu, but once again still too far away from the system to directly impact it. The microwave image pass shows us very, very intense convection. This is the eye right in there. Very intense convection right through here on the edge of that eye wall to the southeastern quadrant of that eye wall. That's probably where we're going to find the maximum wind gusts. It may also be starting what we call an eye wall replacement cycle, and that could be one of the reasons why we're seeing a very ragged eye at the moment, and rather than any real forced weakening of the system just yet. As we look at this system in relation to wind shear, and this is eventually what will either kill this system or weaken it dramatically, and this could also be the catalyst for why the system could push back to the west, back towards the Queensland coast. Now, if we have a look at this particular feature in the red box here, this is an upper level anticyclone. Now, cyclones love to develop underneath these things. Now we can see that Freda's not quite underneath that. It's a few hundred kilometers, actually it's a fair way now away from that upper level anticyclone. But the other thing that upper level anticyclones allow is all the waste at the upper levels of the thunderstorm development to be transported away from the center of the system. And the system, or cyclones, require that because they choke on themselves if they can't get rid of that waste product. And so what happens is thunderstorms build, and the top of those storms need to be pushed away from the middle of the system. And so it has a really nice, what we call poleward outflow channel. And so really nice, you can see right along these lines here, where the upper levels, you can see a lot of upper level cloud coming off or streaming off this cyclone and heading out this way. Now cyclones really like that, and the other thing that's actually helping that along is we have an upper level trough out here in the Western Coral Sea. So in the red shaded region, we've got areas of extreme wind shear. And in that region, or just east of that region, is an area where cyclones are allowed to develop and rapidly intensify. Anywhere around or in that red area, cyclones cannot possibly intensify because there's just way too much wind shear. But if you just go east of that, just away from that, they'll have a very nice outflow channel, or an enhancement of that outflow channel. So it lets that waste get away quickly so it can build new and stronger thunderstorms. And the quicker it can build them and the stronger it can build them, the more wind that comes in to replace the air going up. And so therefore cyclones will form and rapidly deepen in this environment. Now, if we have a look why we expect this cyclone to start to weaken as it drifts to the south and then southeast, we can see this is its forecast track. Now, its forecast track keeps it in a fairly nice environment of 20 knots or less of wind shear, but as it starts to approach, or as it starts to get further to the south, it starts to encounter 20 to 30 knots of wind shear. Now, 20 to 30 knots of wind shear will start to weaken a tropical cyclone. Once it gets to above about 30 knots of wind shear, the cyclone will weaken pretty rapidly. And so we see here on the Saffir-Simpson scale, it goes from a Category 3 hurricane to a Category 2 to a Category 1 back to a tropical storm by the time this model has it, or this agency has it, impacting New Caledonia. So this is the saving grace for New Caledonia, is the fact that we've got so much wind shear in this region. And the wind shear is actually brought about by a high pressure system down south and the upper level trough. So what we've got at the surface, we've got winds that want to push the cyclone back out towards Queensland, or back to the west. And then in the upper levels, we have winds that try to push the system out towards the southeast. And so what we have is this battle. As the cyclone tries to build thunderstorms, the thunderstorms want to try and push back towards the coast, but then the tops and the middle parts of those storms get pushed way back out towards New Zealand, and the cyclone really can't get itself together structurally to intensify further. And what it does is it eventually starts to weaken. And so that's the sort of trend we're expecting as it encounters this increase in wind shear. If we have a look at where this cyclone is going to go, according to some of the dynamical modelling, the GFS is extremely stubborn and continues to push it southeast and basically along the upper level winds or the mid-level winds, and it doesn't suggest that the system will weaken far enough or enough as it gets to New Caledonia for what the other scenarios are going to suggest that it'll do. So the GFS model very, very clearly wants to push it out towards New Zealand eventually, but smacking into New Caledonia, and smacking into New Caledonia without weakening too much. So the problem with the GFS model when we look at tropical cyclones is it tends to underestimate the effect of wind shear on a tropical cyclone's intensity and circulation. So it's ploughing it through 30, 40 knots of wind shear, and it's smashing it into the island without weakening it one little bit. And that seems to be a little far-fetched. There's not too many cyclones that'll ever do that in their lifetime. So we may have a problem with this track. The other track is the UK Met, and the UK Met is normally reasonably accurate, but it seems to be off its tree at the moment. It has the system pushing to the southwest and then out to the east. It just doesn't make sense. And the No Gaps model has ditched the idea last night. If you watched our video last night, it had it pushing out towards Queensland and then going southeast. It's ditched that idea and gone to a much more sensible, more southerly movement as opposed to a southwesterly. Now, the one big model that's not in there is the European, and we'll show you what that one's suggesting now. Okay, folks, now we're going to use the Euro model, but I would like it noted firstly, before we even start looking at the Euro model, that the Euro model has already got it wrong. It's already got the intensity of this tropical cyclone completely underestimated. So it's only just going for perhaps a Category 2 cyclone. So automatically the Euro starts off on the back foot compared to, let's have a look at the GFS. The GFS has a much more symmetrical, and we just saw that, a much more symmetrical, much tighter looking, much stronger looking system. So the GFS is automatically off to a good start. Now, that's important because these two models differ a fair bit in what they do with this system. And so if it starts wrong, the chances are it's going to continue wrong and get worse as the progression goes. But in terms of its actual spot that it's starting at, the European and the GFS have got it pretty well spot on. So if we continue looking at the Euro from here, and we start looking at tomorrow night, and by tomorrow night we see just a general southward trend in this particular cyclone, but already starting to show weakening trends by tomorrow night. And then by Tuesday night, we really see the system weakening a lot in terms of its wind strength, and now with only gales appearing, this model has actually weakened it that far that it's no longer a tropical cyclone if we were to use the strict definition of one in 2 days. So that's how much the Euro has it weakening, and if we just compare that to the GFS model at the same time, that's where the Euro had it. Have a look where the GFS has it. The GFS has it at the same time, a lot further east and a lot stronger, still weakening slightly as it approaches the New Caledonian coastline, but still a significant tropical cyclone. And if we have a look as this one makes landfall or gets right up to New Cal, and then we compare that with the with the European back again, so that's where it's making landfall right there. And we compare that with where the Euro has the system, and it really is no comparison. The Euro just has one weak, sloppy low way out here to the northwest of New Caledonia. Now, if we have a look at what the other conditions are like here, and we look at wind shear at the time, the Euro model has a lot of wind shear over the top of this system, 40 knots plus. Now, cyclones cannot survive that, and that's what the Euro is showing. Now, if we have a look at how that compares to the GFS model about wind shear, and we see that the GFS model is being a little, let's just say it's not taking it into account, because it's got this cyclone still reasonably strong as it's ploughing through 40 plus knots of wind shear, and it just doesn't happen in the real world. And so this is why we have to question the GFS model output at this particular time frame, is if that shear happens, the model is really overestimating the potential intensity of this tropical cyclone with that sort of atmospheric surrounding environment. So let's say we assume that the GFS model, and it is a big assumption, let's say we assume that the GFS model is slightly off with its prediction of the system being able to plough through 40 plus knots of wind shear, and let's say the Euro is more on the money. Let's have a look from where my cursor is, how it travels over the next few days. And so this is now by Thursday night. You can see the system also travels a little bit eastwards, but it's a really, really big sloppy low, and therefore it's not going to be governed by the upper level winds. And if we have a look at what the upper level winds at the time are doing, we see that's where it is there. We see we've got upper level northwesterlies. Now those northwesterlies are obviously going to try to push it out through New Cal and towards New Zealand eventually, but the key thing to note here is because the system's so weak at the time, the chances are that those upper level winds may not be able to grab it, and therefore it's going to be steered by winds closer to the surface, and the winds closer to the surface are flowing the other way. And the model actually does that exact thing that I mentioned from here. So you can see this is where we left the low, and now as we track towards Friday and then Saturday, you can see the system beginning to push back towards the west, and you can see it very clearly pushing towards the west and very quickly pushing towards the west as it's governed by winds closer down to the surface of the Earth. And you can also see that it's not really a tropical cyclone by our definition of it, because it's only producing, as it approaches the Queensland coast, it only produces gales to its southern side or southern quadrants, and they're not really wrapping around the system. So likely not to be a tropical cyclone according to this modeling, but still likely to produce some very heavy, some very strong winds and heavy rain. Now look, this is now the favoured scenario compared to what we would have said 24 hours ago, where we would have assumed it was going to go straight down towards New Zealand. This has now become the favoured scenario purely and simply because the GFS model seems to be doing some silly things with regards to the steering of the system and the intensity of the system as it encounters the upper level trough. Now the great thing about computer models is that they are run more than once a day, and they do pick up on changing conditions, and they do pick up when they completely stuff something up. And the GFS just in the last few minutes has just released its latest run, and if we have a look at how this progresses, this is after the cyclones hit New Caledonia, continues moving to the south, and if you have a look now at how GFS makes it react to the change in the upper level flow, you can start to see that even GFS now pick the system up and start to push it back towards the Queensland coast or the northeastern New South Wales coast. But once again, they also weaken the system as they do that. So you can see that the model is picking up the fact that it may have made a bit of a boo-boo on its track to the southeast at this point in time based on the current projections of the atmosphere, and so it tries to correct that by pushing the system back and does what EC does with it, although much further south. EC has the system then crossing around Mackay. This one will have the system crossing much closer to the Brisbane, southeast Queensland, northeast New South Wales area. Once again, probably not looking at that as a tropical cyclone because it's only real wind strength is to the south of the centre. There's no real winds to its north, so maybe a hybrid type tropical low, a hybrid type low feature as it approaches, but still enough to cause a lot of rain and a lot of wind if you happen to be south of it. As I say, this is one of a number of scenarios. There is another scenario which just has the system washing out here due to wind shear and not redeveloping at all and not pushing west, just sitting there and dying. There is one more train of thought, and this is now a less likely scenario, that the system continues to track southeast or south-southeast towards the North Island of New Zealand. That is now becoming less of an option based on the latest model run. So come next Sunday, folks, we have three options here by the looks of our ensemble modelling, and the first option is Queensland coastline as a reasonably strong low, if not very, very weak cyclone, but unsure if it's actually going to be tropical or not. The other option is here as a very, very weak trophy type low, and the other option is continuing through to the North Island of New Zealand. At this stage, none of them are really favoured, but the projections are starting to push towards this option becoming the more likely of the three. But as I say, there's still no clear indication, and we can't confidently say, yep, Queensland coast, brace yourself for a bit of wind and rain. What we can say is that out of the three options at the moment, the latest trend in the model guidance is suggesting that this option is starting to become the favoured option. And once again, this option looks at a crossing somewhere between, or an approaching of the coast somewhere between the Mackay through to southeast Queensland border area. So that's starting to be the trending option out of the three. But we could just as easily tomorrow night come back at you and say that we're now expecting it to go to New Zealand. There is still enough model divergence to suggest that any of these three options are still quite likely. So the first threat is at obviously New Caledonia, but as I say, the good news for them is that it is expected to weaken due to wind shear on its approach. After that, three options, this one's starting to become a little bit more favoured than the other two. As we head into next Monday, our attention starts to drift back towards the northwest because this particular system should have either made landfall, be very close to making landfall or inland by that stage, or not posing any type of threat whatsoever to Australia and just staying offshore or heading towards New Zealand or just east of New Zealand. So by that stage, whatever Freda's going to do, it would have probably done it. So we then start to drift our attention back to the northwest, where a new potential low could form in one of probably three areas, but at the moment the model's suggesting two areas. The third area could be out here between the Tiwis and Timor. On the Tuesday, where the ensemble modelling is also suggesting some lower pressure in this area remaining. It's tied up between having a low here or a low here. It's not quite sure what it wants to do with whichever one it decides to form. Obviously this one's very close to where Mitchell formed, and so it's probably going to adopt a very similar track if it did do that. This one becomes a little bit more concerning if this one decides to happen. So one of these two probably going to happen, or possibly I should say going to happen. You can't say probably this far out, but possibly going to happen. And then obviously this one a little bit more concerning than this one just because of where it is. And now we're heading a long way out, so we're not really too concerned this far out about where exactly things are happening. But it looks overall like there's going to be lower pressure throughout this 1004 region, and also this area particularly where the yellow lies inside the 1004 region is this area right there and that area right there. One of those could be a region, or that entire region actually could be a region that we are looking at a possible low. A little bit colder on the Northern Territory WA type formation region, but as I say, it's so far out at the moment that we could come back to, as we said last night, a region of low forming here and then pushing out to the west. So that's where we could go to, but at this stage still too far out for us to say. The biggest thing we're watching is Freda and Freda's long-term movement, and long-term, as I say, the models are now starting to trend. They're starting to trend with this sort of track and then coming back and pushing in along the ridging that will develop here and pushing it back out to the northwest and hitting the Queensland coast as a very weak system. Remember, it's not going to be in a great spot for further development or rapid intensification as it approaches the coast, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. Alright folks, thanks very much for watching tonight. As I say, it's a very fascinating situation with Freda. We'll keep you updated, and as we head into the end of the first week of January, we'll be watching this particular region like a hawk for future development. Thanks for watching tonight, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow. Good night.